The year is 1865. America was recovering from the Civil War. The land, once full of fierce fighting, is now hushed. Hundreds of thousands of lives are gone like dust in the hands of history. To the east, cities are crumbling and people are raising their lives from the ruins, but their hearts are still full of bitterness. The world is forever changed. But the west is a different world. There are no rules. There is wildness, freedom, and unknown dangers. But it is here that those who are desperate to find a place in the old world flee. Rebecca Elder stands on the porch of an old wagon, her eyes staring into the empty distance. She's a 20-year-old girl from devastated Georgia. Years of war have left scars not only on the land, but also in her soul. Loss, fear, and shadows she can't etch from her memory. She was alone among those left behind. But now, along with her younger brother Eddie, she is about to hit the road. These lands have become a symbol of hope for Rebecca, a chance for a new beginning. They leave the ruins of their past, leaving scorched towns and shattered families behind, hoping to find something more in the wilds of the West.
Through the ruins, we walk toward the new. Though each step is painful, we pray for a new beginning, but know that beyond every horizon awaits an unconquered land.
Eddie, her younger brother, watches her quietly from his seat beside her. Still just a child, but with that look that can't be fooled. He believes that the West is not just a place, but a symbol of hope. Swaying in her seat, Rebecca feels the wagon leave the familiar confines and head into a land of only wind and vastness. The unknown awaits them. But with each turn of the wheel, she feels a little bit of heaviness leave her heart.
Are we really leaving, Rebecca?
Yes, we are. But remember, things will be different where we are.
The road to eternity opens up before them, but with that horizon comes her doubts. How far can one travel away from oneself? The caravan moved slowly, out of habit, trying not to waste time. The wheels creaked, the smell of dust and dried grass lingered in the air. Rebecca sat next to Eddie's brother, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, where the golden plains stretched into the vastness. Eddie hummed something softly, swaying his feet slightly. Everything seemed peaceful, but Rebecca felt a strange uneasiness in her chest. The world they were leaving was too close. Sometimes it could be felt in the simplest things.
Do you still believe we'll find a place here we can call home?
Eddie turned to her and smiled, not realizing that this might have been the last moment they could speak without fear.
You always said the land would be new in the West, didn't you?
He added with a cheerful look, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that their journey had already begun to change something inside her. She didn't want to admit it, but the anxiety was growing stronger by the hour. And then everything changed. A thunderstorm rose inexorably in the sky. The surrounding world immediately became dark, like a ghost slipping between the clouds. Only a few minutes later, they heard screams.
What is it?
At times, it seemed as if time was slowing down. From behind the tall grasses, like shadows, figures in tattered robes jumped out. Mercenaries, Confederate survivors, armed to the teeth, with faces hidden under black hoods.
Stop, now!
In front of Rebecca's eyes, everything shrank in an instant. No plan, no words, just quick movement. The mercenaries were attacking the caravan, looting, death. Rebecca turned around in horror, only to see her brother Eddie jump up and fire a shot. His gun rattled, but the return shot felled him. The bullet pierced his chest.
No, Eddie.
Her scream was drowned in the general chaos. Rebecca rushed to him, but everything around her was already covered in blood, guns, death, and her own body full of terror. She grabbed his arm, trying desperately to pull him out from under his body. His eyes were open, but already empty.
Don't, Eddie, don't die.
But he was dead, in her arms, and so were her hopes. Bullets were whizzing around. Everything was falling apart. It wasn't just an attack, it was more than that. One of the mercenaries tried to grab her, but she broke free and, not realizing where she was running, ran into the forest. She fell, losing strength, rocks and earth scratching under her fingernails. A thunderstorm covered the ground like a black, dense blanket, but she didn't care. Pain, fatigue, hunger, and fear all mixed together in one endless moment until she fell to the ground, choking, bleeding. Rebecca lay there, unable to believe what she had lost. No, it couldn't be true. Eddie couldn't be dead. Her body was shaken by an endless cold, and her eyes filled with tears as she tried to make sense of this chaos, this world that was too cruel. Only one thought echoed in her head. He was gone, and wouldn't be coming back. Her first loss, a moment that should have destroyed her, but something, like a spark, still burned in her soul. She couldn't believe she had to move on now, but there was no choice. The first crack appeared in her heart. The world she knew was full of grief and loss, and she felt a wall growing that she would now have a hard time breaking down. It was a dark night, rough ground under her fingernails, and a mysterious void ahead. Rebecca ran deep into the forest, not knowing where. Pain, hunger, and fear made her thoughts confused. She couldn't hear footsteps on the ground, only the loud beats of her heart. The horror of losing her brother haunted her, leaving no moment for peace. Everywhere seemed foreign, even the simple things that used to bring comfort. She found shelter in a cave hidden among the rocks, barely discernible among the trees, but secluded enough to hide from pursuit. It was damp and dark inside, but there was no more room in her mind for thoughts of comfort. The darkness of the forest surrounded her, and a single thought throbbed in her chest: to preserve her life, if only for one night. But this hiding place did not prove to be empty. When Rebecca pulled her hands away from her face and looked around, her gaze fell immediately on a figure lying in the corner of the cave. It was a man, tall, muscular, dark-skinned, wearing leather armor, and his brown-dented face was covered with several scars. He had been wounded. Rebecca instinctively backed away, but his eyes snapped open. The moment they met gaze, silence and tension so painfully foreign left her shocked. Takatomah. She remembered at once the vague stories that had hitherto come from the mouths of those who avoided Indians, savages, murderers, enemies of civilization. But something in his gaze was too human, too familiar to believe those stereotypes at once. Fear overpowered her instincts, and she backed away, but something inside her said, "Leave him alone." He couldn't speak English. His language was as foreign to her as his people. But his gaze spoke far more than words. It was weak, bloodshot, and it was a clear sign that he was not the enemy, at least at this moment. Rebecca didn't know what to do. On the one hand, he was an enemy, an Indian, perhaps a murderer. On the other, he was a human being, wounded and helpless. Her deep-seated prejudices and her own survival instincts collided in her mind. Her hand involuntarily reached for the modest medical kit she carried with her. She looked at it, hesitated, and finally took the first step. She approached the wounded man and, without saying a word, began to examine his wound. He didn't move, his body tense but not hostile. Rebecca noticed his eyes widen slightly as she carefully dressed his wound, and a subtle gratitude flickered in his gaze. She tied the cloth carefully, cleaning the bleeding wound, and remained silent the entire time. And, the more she worked, the stranger that silence became. It was not one of rage or fear. It was the silence of two people who were perhaps on the threshold of something new and unexpected. When her hands stopped on the last movement, he sighed slightly and tried to speak in his own language. His words were unfamiliar to her, but his intonation was soft, not threatening. Rebecca didn't understand him, but it didn't matter. He was alive. That was what mattered.
Thank you.
She nodded, realizing that this was probably all she could do for him. Doubts began to awaken in her soul. Was he an enemy, or was he just another man, a victim of circumstance like herself? His gaze, like a weapon, penetrated her mind, making her forget her pain and loss. His silence was all the more heavy than his words, but there was more than silent gratitude in their gaze. There was something more. His silence was like a challenge, a question she had to answer. What if all these stories of enemies were just an illusion? What if this man, this Cheyenne warrior, was not an enemy, but salvation? For long minutes they sat in silence, and despite the fact that their worlds were so different, this silence somehow allowed them to find some strange understanding of each other. Rebecca couldn't understand it fully, but perhaps she didn't need to. It didn't matter. She stood up, about to continue on her way. But now, no matter what happened next, she knew that the world was not as she had imagined it, and this meeting, this silence, was her first step on a path that would lead her to something she could not even imagine. The darkness of night was gradually giving way to first light, but their path through the forests remained still as unpredictable. Takatomah moved ahead, his steps confident despite his wounds, but he was in no hurry. It was as if he knew where he was going, knew every rock and tree along the way. Rebecca walked behind him, uncertain, with her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings. She couldn't shake the feeling that this forest was not just a place, but a trap in which they were both victims of their own fears. Takatomah turned to her several times, and each time his gaze was serious but calm. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't in a rush. He was leaving her space, letting her know that he could protect her, but would not impose his help. Rebecca tried to understand how he managed to move so calmly among these wild spaces when her own fears left not a moment's peace. They moved slowly through the dense forest until they heard sounds, talking, footsteps, the clanking of weapons. Rebecca listened warily, her fingers tightening on the hilt of her knife. They were hunters, wandering these lands. Their conversation echoed lightly, and as they came closer, their figures became visible in the gaps between the trees. One of the hunters, noticing them, froze. His gaze immediately stopped on Takatomah. He was clearly wary. The second hunter also saw the Indian and instinctively moved his elbow and put his hand on the hilt of his weapon.
"Hey, you, stop!"
The voice was gruff and wary. Rebecca froze, unsure of what to do. A weight seemed to slip from her heart, but instead of running, she suddenly felt the flame of protective instinct melt her fear. Her hands trembled, but she stood before Takatomah.
He's not dangerous. He is not an enemy. He's helping me.
Her voice sounded determined, even though she still didn't know how they could get past this barrier. The hunter glanced at her, surprised and suspicious.
"What are you saying? It's a Cheyenne. Are you with him willingly?"
His words were full of furious bewilderment. Rebecca could feel her heart beating faster, the tension growing in her. This situation was familiar, as if the whole world had suddenly returned to those hard days in the South when her family could be destroyed by the hands of strangers just for being different from those who wore the uniform.
He's not my enemy.
Her words came out firmly, but not without nervousness.
I decide who I go with.
Her answer was a challenge, a response to everything she'd learned over the past few days. The struggle with her own prejudices, her old beliefs, and finally those who, like her, were in search of peace. And while she still didn't know exactly who was an enemy and who was a friend, it was her decision, and she was willing to stand for it. The hunters exchanged glances, and despite their doubts, no weapons were raised, but the atmosphere remained tense.
"You apparently don't realize how dangerous these people are, girl."
His voice was barely restrained.
"The Cheyenne have never liked outsiders. He could be a threat."
Takatomah was silent. He stood, motionless as stone, his eyes nothing more than two dark specks in a light forest. But it was in that silence that there was more power than in any words. Rebecca looked at his face, then back at the hunters, feeling her heart clench hard. She could scarcely imagine what these people felt when they saw an Indian. To them, it was not merely a foreign face, but a symbol of all they feared. And she, in turn, was afraid. Scared, not for her life, but for his. For the fact that she could be wrong. For the fact that her decision would bring down her confidence.
You don't understand. He's not hostile. He lost his family, just like I did.
Her words hung in the air. The hunters looked at her, their expressions softened, but the fear did not disappear. Behind their backs were still the same wars that destroyed the world without dividing people by color or culture. and Rebecca could feel their gazes sliding over her as if she was suddenly something incomprehensible. The silence stretched out. It was as if time had stopped. Takatomah stepped forward, and his movement was smooth, sure. He said something in his own language, and though Rebecca didn't understand a word, it reassured her. It wasn't toward the hunters. He was saying something to her, something reassuring, words that held silence like a spell, warning that this path was only theirs in common. Takatomah didn't try to defend himself. He was silent, but his presence spoke for him. Finally, the hunters relaxed. One of them raised his hands, refusing to be conflicted.
I don't believe he is that simple. But if you are with him, that is your choice.
With those words, they turned and walked away, leaving Rebecca and Takatomah alone. When they were back in the shade of the trees, Rebecca felt how hard it was for her to believe. Everything she had thought about the world, all those lessons that had been embedded in her mind, had been nearly obliterated by this encounter. And yet something in her soul began to change gradually. It was not about the Indians, not about the hunters, but about herself. Takatomah looked at her, his gaze calm. But in his eyes, Rebecca saw something else, not threat, but understanding. And there was something almost human in that look that made her feel that her own journey was just beginning.
You saved me,
She said, despite all her restraint. He only nodded, and their journey continued. The river was turbulent. The stream, like a living creature, was chasing forward, roaring and clamorously overcoming everything in its path. The sound of the water drowned out the sounds of the forest, and everything seemed to disappear into the stream. Rebecca and Takatomah stood on its bank. Before them was a deep, agitated river that had to be crossed to continue their journey. Rebecca looked at the river, her face tense. She could see the stream pounding against the rocks, the water surging into foam as if nature itself was protesting against people crossing it. She knew the crossing would be difficult, that she was taking a risk, but there was no choice. Takatomah stood beside her. Without making a sound, he studied the river, assessing the direction of the current, the depth of the water. His calmness and confidence in this moment was so obvious, it made Rebecca feel better. He looked as if he was part of this element, as if he was a river himself, part of something powerful and fearless.
How are we going to do this?
Her voice sounded almost a whisper, afraid to break the harmony of the moment. Takatomah nodded, and without a word took the first step into the water. The water rolled up his legs, and then higher, almost to his knees. He kept moving without stopping, and Rebecca, feeling more than just fear, followed him. When she stepped into the river, the cold waters immediately enveloped her feet. The current was strong, and her feet began to slip on the rocks. She felt the water tugging at her, trying to drag her down. Fear gripped her. She wasn't sure she could do it. Her heart raced and she tried to take the next step, but her strength began to leave her. The water suddenly picked her up and she felt her body go under. Rebecca screamed, but the sound was drowned in the roar of the river. The force of the stream swept her up, and everything around her was a whirlpool, distorted, filled only with the frenzied undulations of the elements. Takatomah, without thinking, rushed after her. He grabbed her arm, pulling her out of the water with such force that her breath was nearly cut off. He didn't say a word, but his actions spoke for themselves. He held her tightly, not letting the water carry her away until he brought her to a calmer shore. They were both left standing on dry land, breathing heavily, drenched in cold sweat, but alive. Takatomah let go of her hand, looking around to make sure she was all right. He stood silent, but his eyes said it all. There was a fear for her in them that he couldn't hide. Rebecca stood up shakily, her heart still pounding frantically in her chest. She took a breath and looked up at his face. He was there, helping her, but he hadn't said a word. And that silence had become as important to her as any comfort. She felt that this river was more than just a natural obstacle. It was a boundary separating past and future, a river that had become their watershed. Rebecca and Takatomah had crossed it, not only physically, but emotionally. The water took away some of their fear, made them grow stronger. When her breathing returned to normal, she looked at him with gratitude, and for the first time, after many days of silence, she said his name correctly.
Takatomah.
He was slightly surprised, but a shadow of a smile flashed in his eyes. This was their first real interaction, and though she barely spoke, there was a tenderness and acceptance in her voice that they both may have needed at that moment. She felt her own barriers crumble with every second she spent next to him. Everything before this river, her past, her fears, her perception of the world, seemed so far away now. The water had taken some of her old fears and left her on the other shore.
You saved me.
Her voice was barely audible, but sincere. Takatomah nodded, but didn't speak. He just kept looking at her, as if that look itself was the answer. They had both experienced more than just crossing the river. It was a true test, the beginning of a new life for both of them. And in that moment, standing on the other side of the river, Rebecca realized that perhaps she was no longer the person she had been before that day. She hadn't just crossed the river. She had crossed the divide between what was and what could have been. A new world had opened up before her, a world where anything was possible, even trust and understanding. They continued on their journey. But now, with this new knowledge, with new feelings, they walked not just as two wanderers, but as people who began to understand each other. A dark night had fallen on the forest. Only the faint light from the fire and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the space around them. The wind was cold, and all Rebecca could hear was its whistling in the tree branches. She sat across from the fire. Her face seemed calm in its flicker, but inside her a storm of emotions raged. Everything she had experienced over the past few days left her exhausted and breathing heavily, but she kept going, along with Takatomah. Just when the silence seemed almost overpowering, there was a sound in the forest that made her heart sink. A rustle in the bushes. A beast. And that rustle was too loud to be a normal prey. Rebecca immediately sensed that it wasn't just a deer or a fox, it was a predator, something large and dangerous. She turned sharply to Takatomah, his eyes already following her. He, too, felt threatened. There was a flicker of tension in his gaze. He knew this night could end tragically for both of them. Slowly but surely, Takatomah stood up, gesturing for her to join him. He pointed into the darkness of the night. Rebecca instinctively clenched the knife in her hand, her breathing quickening.
Be ready, bear.
She nodded, her heart beating faster. Rebecca had never encountered such a beast. She had heard stories about bears, but facing it in reality was something completely different. Takatomah walked over to his bow and pulled out his arrows. His movements were quick and precise, as if he was part of this night, part of the forest. She knew he was facing a battle, and it made her even more afraid. And then, from behind the trees, a huge grizzly loomed like a shadow. His eyes gleamed in the dim light of the fire. Rebecca froze in place. The bear was majestic and dangerous, its sheer mass leaving no doubt that it was not to be trifled with. He moved slowly toward them, his footsteps deafening like the beats of a drum, and his breath burst from his nostrils with a loud growl.
Distract him.
She didn't ask any questions. It was a command, and she was used to trusting his instincts by now. Rebecca brought her hand to the fire, grabbing a rock, and began throwing it towards the bear. She knew her throws wouldn't kill the beast, but they were meant to distract it, to give Takatomah a chance. The bear turned toward her, growling. Rebecca felt her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely hear the sounds around her, only her fear. Suddenly, at the very moment the bear lunged toward her, Takatomah fired a shot. The arrow pierced the beast in the shoulder, but the bear did not stop. It was rapidly gaining speed, ready to tear her apart. At that moment, Rebecca screamed without thinking of the consequences. She realized that this was her only chance to survive. Everything was happening so fast. With each step, the bear was getting closer and closer, and now it was one step away from her. But Takatomah fired again, and the arrow went straight into the belly of the beast. This time the bear stopped, swaying, and with a fierce roar fell to the ground. It did not move again. They both stood there, breathing heavily. Rebecca held back tears, trying not to let the fear take over her completely. She was terrified. The feeling that her life hung in the balance never left her. Takatomah walked over to her. His eyes remained calm, but his body was tense. He grabbed her shoulder, checking to see if she was hurt.
I couldn't help but scream.
Takatomah silently leaned over and without a word placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, but rather a quiet acknowledgement of her strength. He didn't need words to understand what she was going through. It was their moment of silent agreement. He protected her. She distracted the beast. Together, they had survived. In that moment, Rebecca felt the pain and fear begin to fade away. All that remained was a quiet, almost intangible, but infinitely important trust between them. She looked up at him. He was the one who had saved her, but his silence, his actions, his steadfastness spoke of so much more. He wasn't just protecting her. He was showing her how to be strong. They walked back to the fire. Rebecca sat down, her hands shaking and her body feeling tired. She tried to put her thoughts in order, and at that moment again, as always, her memories took her back in time. She remembered her brother Eddie. He was so brave, but even he wouldn't be able to handle that bear. In his memory, she had seen so much. And now, as she sat by the fire, as much time had passed since his death, she wanted to share it.
My brother, he was always there for me when I was scared. He and I got through everything, but I didn't get to tell him everything. He died.
Her voice trembled. But Takatomah just listened. He understood. He didn't need words. He placed his hand on her shoulder, silently expressing his support. That gesture was more important to her than all the love and comfort another soul could offer. In that moment, Rebecca realized pain and loss do not create distance between people. On the contrary, they can bring them together. Snow fell from the sky like feathers, swirling in swirls, driven by a sharp and icy wind. The blizzard was unrelenting, its whistle penetrating into the depths of the forest, winding through the trees and into every crevice. It was merciless, and every step they took seemed like an attempt to survive in a cruel, almost living world. Everything around them was white, pure, but merciless at the same time. Rebecca could no longer look at the snow that wouldn't stop falling, knowing no pity. The wind was so strong that she could barely lift her head. Her whole body felt like it was frozen. Every movement was difficult, and her thoughts were becoming more and more cloudy. She walked beside Takatomah, who seemed to remain calm despite the storm. His face was hidden under a blanket of fur, but she could feel his calmness like never before.
We won't make it to the settlement.
Her voice was drowned in the whistling wind. She didn't know how they would survive this storm. But Takatomah turned around and nodded without saying a word. His confidence was like the tip of an arrow aiming for the target. He led her in the direction of the shelter they were to find. At last, they found a small place under a deadwood tree. Nature here was somehow cruel and caring at the same time. The old trees were lying down, but their trunks created a small shelter from the incessant wind. Takatomah quickly and skillfully began to build a temporary shelter using whatever was at hand, branches, leaves, and a few large rocks to reinforce them.
Help me.
Rebecca, though exhausted, clenched her teeth and began to help. She knew they couldn't last long in this storm if they didn't find shelter. Every moment, every gesture was important. Her hands were shaking from the cold, but despite that, she did what she could to help. When the shelter was ready, they sat down side by side, sheltered from the wind. Rebecca was exhausted, her body ached from the cold, but the worst part was that she felt so alone. The storm had sort of taken away everything that was left of her former life, and she could no longer remember the last time she had felt safe. Takatomah, sitting next to her, took her shoulder. He was cold, but his touch was warm in its silence. He placed his shoulder next to hers, as if offering protection from all this storm, from the whole world that seemed so foreign. In that silence, amidst the raging storm, Rebecca felt her heart slow its rhythm for the first time. Safety. She was beside him, and though she couldn't understand everything that was happening, she felt she wasn't alone. It was so unexpected, so incongruous in light of all the horrors she'd experienced. But she could feel his presence. It was more than just a need to be near him. It was like an instinctive trust, and her fear that had held her for so long began to melt away. Takatomah took a small leather pouch from his bag and pulled out small pieces of bark from there. He rubbed them carefully against the stone, and the smell of herbs rose into the air. This wasn't just an ordinary medicinal gathering. This was a ritual. He offered her some of the herbs to keep her warm.
Strength. Need strength.
Rebecca nodded, took the herbs, and felt the warmth begin to spread through her body. In this small shelter, in this cruel and merciless world, she felt her heart slowly calm down. She was with him. Suddenly he spoke. Rebecca looked at him in surprise.
Nea Eshe.
Her eyes widened, and she didn't realize right away.
What was that?
He repeated the words, looking into her eyes. His voice was soft, but firm. It wasn't just a phrase, it was more than just a word. She felt his voice penetrating her soul, his words touching something in her.
You are strong.
He looked at her, and her eyes met his. He didn't wait for an answer, just the words. Quiet, but in them was all the strength she had been searching for so long. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. These words, these simple words, seemed to tear her apart. She didn't know what was more important to her, the phrase itself or the fact that he had said them to her. She gritted her teeth, but still she couldn't hold back the tears. In that moment, she didn't feel weak or vulnerable. On the contrary, she felt as if her strength had returned. She felt like she was not alone. She could finally trust. Her tears rolled down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. She wasn't alone. He was there for her. And in this storm, in this crazy world, she felt not only her vulnerability, but her incredible strength. Takatomah didn't say a word. He just hugged her, strongly, but gently. The warmth of his presence was what her soul was searching for in this cold world. The silence of the woods after the encounter with the bandits was menacing. Rebecca stood, her chest heaving heavily with quick breaths, her hands still shaking. The moments that had just flashed through her mind seemed unreal. When the bandits appeared again, it would be too late. She knew that neither stealth nor luck would save them anymore. The bandits were the ones who had killed her brother, and now they were coming for them. They said it bluntly, with contempt. Traitor to the race. Angry as animals, not even understanding the nature of their hatred. But Rebecca couldn't back down, couldn't let them take another. They came closer and closer. One of the bandits approached with a gun at the ready. The other, the older one, with a sly smirk on his face, stared at Takatomah, his black eyes full of hatred.
You think this animal alliance with him is going to save you, girl?
Rebecca couldn't listen to them anymore. With every word she felt her inner world, full of fear, crumbling like sand. She was no longer the naive girl who had thought that everything in the West would be like the pictures in books.
I'm not a traitor, and you are a criminal.
Gangster one laughed, and the other, more violent one, aimed his gun at Takatomah with a vicious grin.
You realize he can't get away, don't you? These aren't just Indians. These are enemies that must be destroyed.
Rebecca felt the blood begin to rush through her veins. For too long she had been silent. Too long she had hidden her fear. But when she saw Takatomah already taking a step forward, her resolve strengthened. Instead of running or hiding, she stepped forward, stood between Takatomah and the bandits like a shield.
You won't touch him.
Takatomah looked at her in surprise, and Rebecca met his gaze with hardness in her eyes. In that moment, she felt her fear leave. There was strength in him, strength in their bond. It was a moment when the boundaries between her and the alien world disappeared. She wasn't just a woman they could destroy. She had become an integral part of this world. As the bandit raised his gun, Rebecca grabbed the rifle she was holding and fired swiftly, without a moment's hesitation. The bullet pierced the air and pierced the neck of one of the bandits, who, screaming, collapsed to the ground. The others froze in terror. Takatomah acted quickly. He instantly grabbed his bow, drew the bowstring, and fired. The arrow plunged into the chest of another bandit. It happened so fast that Rebecca didn't even have time to catch her breath. Only now, when the fight was on the verge of being over, did she feel her heart pounding frantically in her chest. The third bandit, seeing his death in the face of Takatomah, ran. But Rebecca had no doubt. He wouldn't get away. She took aim and fired again, knocking the gun out of his hands. The bandits began to panic, and seeing that their chances were almost gone, rushed into the woods. One of them, darkness on his face, turned around and cast another baleful glance at Rebecca, but then disappeared into the woods. Rebecca and Takatomah stood, breathing heavily in the silence that came after the fight. She felt her legs shaking with fatigue, but she stood still, leaning on her rifle. Takatomah, his face still as impassive but with a slight respect in his eyes, approached her.
You're strong.
Rebecca was still shocked. Everything she had just experienced seemed both unreal and creepy at the same time. But there was another voice inside her, a voice that said she was ready to protect the one next to her, the one she was connected to now more than ever.
You are my people.
He stopped, as if he hadn't expected those words, and for a moment their eyes met in silence. His gaze was soft, but full of recognition. He was the one who, despite her differences, had helped her survive, and she realized that she was not alone now.
And you are mine.
And in that quiet acknowledgement, in those simple words, there was more meaning than any promise. There was something more than mere survival, more than even a fight. It was a bond that grew stronger than fear, than war, than all the cruelty of the world around us. The journey was long, and each step seemed to stretch on endlessly. Forest and rocks were replaced by green fields and withered grass, but at last, as their strength began to wane, the Cheyenne camp showed itself in the distance. Little smoky fires surrounded by tents of bison skins, and women, children, men who earned their bread from the land, and of course, warriors. Rebecca stopped, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. This place was foreign, wild, like her first impressions of the Indian world, but she couldn't go back. This was her only way. When they arrived, the gazes of the locals were cold, wary. The women, especially the older ones, did not hide their displeasure. Being among these people, Rebecca felt like an alien element, like something that didn't fit into their world.
She's not ours.
What has she done to deserve a place among us?
Rebecca sensed this hostility immediately. It was not only in the words, but in every look, every gesture. However, there was one thing that surprised her. Takatomah was standing next to her, his calm presence reassuring her, but unable to completely hide the tense atmosphere. They approached the chief, an elder whose face was covered in deep wrinkles and whose eyes were wise and shrewd. He examined Rebecca carefully, glancing from her face to her clothes and weapons.
Your soul does not yet belong to this place. You are alone, as are your people, but you are not alone in this camp, a stranger among your own.
Her heart beat faster. She didn't know what to say back because there was truth in those words. She didn't belong here. But here, too, was something she had sought for so long: salvation. The chief, seeing her confusion, spoke the words that changed everything.
You must pass the test. A night on the rock.
Rebecca felt her eyes widen with surprise. She didn't understand what this meant. What did trial on the cliff mean? It could have been anything.
What is this trial?
Those who seek a place among us must prove their mettle. A night alone on a rock in the hollow. There you will face what is within you.
Rebecca felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Fear gripped her heart, but there was nowhere to go. This was a test she must pass to prove that she could be a part of this world. She nodded, and her heart hammered hard. She would do it. The night. The cliff. As the sun hid behind the horizon, she climbed to the top of the high cliff that towered over the camp. There was only air, emptiness, and coldness all around. This was the place where night collided with reality, and in this dark abyss there seemed to be nothing but herself. She crouched down on a rock, the cold wind burning her face. There was nothing here but the sounds of nocturnal animals and her own thoughts. Each of her thoughts was so loud that her inner voice seemed to reverberate off the rocks and echo back. Her loneliness was agonizing. She thought about her brother, how she had lost him, how her life had been rewritten by the war. She thought about how she ended up here, on this rock, and what awaited her next. Alone, among strangers who didn't understand her. Alone with the very questions that had plagued her soul from the beginning. Everything seemed so vast. The wind continued to whistle, and the darkness enveloped her tighter and tighter. She closed her eyes and felt tears making their way down her cheeks. It wasn't just pain. It was something more. It was the realization that she couldn't run from herself anymore. Fear, loneliness, and her past all mixed together became a part of her. Suddenly, amidst this chaos of thoughts, she heard a voice, quiet but clear.
You are strong. You are not alone.
That word was like an anchor that stopped her inner storm. She opened her eyes, and despite the darkness, she felt the strength building inside her. Her fear, her doubts, it had all become part of her journey, and she realized that she could get through it all. The night passed, and with the first light she descended from the summit, feeling her soul overcome. She returned to the camp, where she was greeted with softer looks. Some of the women were still wary, but now they saw something new in her eyes. Takatomah met her at the foot of the cliff, his face calm, but his eyes full of respect. He said one word, and it was enough.
You have passed the test. You are ours.
The cliff, the night, and the storm were behind her now. Rebecca was part of this world, part of the tribe, and though trust was not yet complete, this night was her first step into a new world. The darkness of night was gradually giving way to first light, but their path through the forests remained still as unpredictable. Takatomah moved ahead, his steps confident despite his wounds, but he was in no hurry. It was as if he knew where he was going, knew every rock and tree along the way. Rebecca walked behind him, uncertain, with her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings. She couldn't shake the feeling that this forest was not just a place, but a trap in which they were both victims of their own fears. Takatomah turned to her several times, and each time his gaze was serious but calm. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't in a rush. He was leaving her space, letting her know that he could protect her, but would not impose his help. Rebecca tried to understand how he managed to move so calmly among these wild spaces when her own fears left not a moment's peace. They moved slowly through the dense forest until they heard sounds, talking, footsteps, the clanking of weapons. Rebecca listened warily, her fingers tightening on the hilt of her knife. They were hunters, wandering these lands. Their conversation echoed lightly, and as they came closer, their figures became visible in the gaps between the trees. One of the hunters, noticing them, froze. His gaze immediately stopped on Takatomah. He was clearly wary. The second hunter also saw the Indian and instinctively moved his elbow and put his hand on the hilt of his weapon.
Hey, you, stop!
The voice was gruff and wary. Rebecca froze, unsure of what to do. A weight seemed to slip from her heart, but instead of running, she suddenly felt the flame of protective instinct melt her fear. Her hands trembled, but she stood before Takatomah.
He's not dangerous. He is not an enemy. He's helping me.
Her voice sounded determined, even though she still didn't know how they could get past this barrier. The hunter glanced at her, surprised and suspicious.
What are you saying? It's a Cheyenne. Are you with him willingly?
His words were full of furious bewilderment. Rebecca could feel her heart beating faster, the tension growing in her. This situation was familiar, as if the whole world had suddenly returned to those hard days in the South when her family could be destroyed by the hands of strangers just for being different from those who wore the uniform.
He's not my enemy.
Her words came out firmly, but not without nervousness.
I decide who I go with.
Her answer was a challenge, a response to everything she'd learned over the past few days. The struggle with her own prejudices, her old beliefs, and finally those who, like her, were in search of peace. And while she still didn't know exactly who was an enemy and who was a friend, it was her decision, and she was willing to stand for it. The hunters exchanged glances, and despite their doubts, no weapons were raised, but the atmosphere remained tense.
You apparently don't realize how dangerous these people are, girl.
His voice was barely restrained.
The Cheyenne have never liked outsiders. He could be a threat.
Takatomah was silent. He stood, motionless as stone, his eyes nothing more than two dark specks in a light forest. But it was in that silence that there was more power than in any words. Rebecca looked at his face, then back at the hunters, feeling her heart clench hard. She could scarcely imagine what these people felt when they saw an Indian. To them, it was not merely a foreign face, but a symbol of all they feared. And she, in turn, was afraid. Scared, not for her life, but for his. For the fact that she could be wrong. For the fact that her decision would bring down her confidence.
You don't understand. He's not hostile. He lost his family, just like I did.
Her words hung in the air. The hunters looked at her, their expressions softened, but the fear did not disappear. Behind their backs were still the same wars that destroyed the world without dividing people by color or culture, and Rebecca could feel their gazes sliding over her as if she was suddenly something incomprehensible. The silence stretched out. It was as if time had stopped. Takatomah stepped forward, and his movement was smooth, sure. He said something in his own language, and though Rebecca didn't understand a word, it reassured her. It wasn't toward the hunters. He was saying something to her, something reassuring, words that held silence like a spell, warning that this path was only theirs in common. Takatomah didn't try to defend himself. He was silent, but his presence spoke for him. Finally, the hunters relaxed. One of them raised his hands, refusing to be conflicted.
I don't believe he is that simple. But if you are with him, that is your choice.
With those words, they turned and walked away, leaving Rebecca and Takatomah alone. When they were back in the shade of the trees, Rebecca felt how hard it was for her to believe. Everything she had thought about the world, all those lessons that had been embedded in her mind, had been nearly obliterated by this encounter. And yet something in her soul began to change gradually. It was not about the Indians, not about the hunters, but about herself. Takatomah looked at her, his gaze calm. But in his eyes, Rebecca saw something else, not threat, but understanding. And there was something almost human in that look that made her feel that her own journey was just beginning.
You saved me,
she said, despite all her restraint. He only nodded, and their journey continued. The years passed. Rebecca's house stood at the edge of the village, among the fields and the winds. It was not a rich mansion, but a modest wooden house, built with love and patience. Poppies bloomed on the porch. Inside, the smell of books, old wood, and something native. Rebecca sat in a rocking chair. Her hair was grey at the temples, but there was still a direct strength in her eyes. Her daughter, a girl of about 8, with dark eyes and a lively gaze, played beside her. In Rebecca's lap lay a box, an antique, dark wood. She opened it, and inside was a pendant, yellowed bone and blackened leather.
It's a gift, but not just a thing. It is a memory, a story. It saved my life once upon a time, and reminded me of who I could be.
The girl listened, eyes wide. Rebecca took the pendant and placed it in her palms.
I'm going to tell you a story about a girl who lost everything and found something more important than gold, finding the truth, and a friend, and herself.
She began to speak. Her voice was steady, calm, like the wind rippling in the grass. Through the window I could see the vastness of the prairie stretching to the horizon. The sun was setting. The camera rose slowly. The view from above. A field, a house, 2 figures on the porch. Then higher up, a vast plain, swaying grass. The wind. Somewhere in the distance, hoofprints almost erased by time, but still alive in the ground.
The Wild West didn't just break. It unlocked a power hidden deep within us, I was a prisoner of fear and became a woman who knows the world changes if you're not afraid to listen and to tell.
If this story touched you, like, subscribe and share it. Because even in the wildest lands, the strongest feelings are born. Trust, honor, and love.